morning, good morning. How's everybody feeling this morning? Now, you know me, I like to be better than that. How's everybody feeling this morning? Wonderful, wonderful. Kids, you glad to be out of school? Yeah. Parents like, no. But listen, we are in a series called Believe, and actually we're going to extend it just one more week next week. And I talked to Pastor Larry. I don't know if we confirm this or not, but I think we want to do communion next week. So I guess we're going to do it because I just said it. So make sure that you're here next week so that we can celebrate the Lord's table together and end off this series fellowshipping in remembrance of what Jesus did for us. Amen. Now, for those who have been praying and who've been calling and really encouraging us, we just want to say, my wife and I and our family, just want to say thank you. Wife and baby Miles are at home doing well. And so thank you for your prayers over the last several weeks as we added a new addition to our home. And I must say, I know he's my child, I must say he's absolutely handsome. He gets it from his dad, I'm just saying. Now, you know, what is interesting is that, you know, we were talking to our children before we were getting ready to come back home with the baby, and we talked to the oldest one, and he said, we said, when the baby comes home, you're not going to be able to run around the apartment like you used to and making noise when you're playing video games, and you're not going to be able to make all that noise that you were making before the baby, because the baby, he's small, he's going to be sleeping a lot, and so you're not going to be able to really be active and making all that noise like you used to. And he looked at us, and you know my son, so some of you are already laughing. He looked at me and my wife, and he says, our lives are ruined, isn't it? And there's a lot of things, because this has probably been almost 5 years since our last baby in the house. And so, there's a lot of things that you kind of forget, and it kind of comes back to you, like you forget how loud and how smelly something so small could be. You kind of forget that. You forget about the waking up every 4 hours and crying. You kind of forget about that. But one of the things that sometimes we forget about when we add a new addition, when there's new birth, but it's something that comes back to us and you're reminded of something, is we forget about the fact that it brings so much joy. Forget about all the other things that you have to struggle with, the waking up every 4 hours and the changing diapers every 2 minutes and all of the different things that come. But there's something about when there's something new that God blesses you with, when there's a new birth that God allows you to experience, it brings tremendous joy. And it's no wonder why when Jesus talks about spiritual transformation, when he wants to give us an image of what it means to really follow him and to really be a person who trusts God with their whole heart, he uses the terminology that you must be born again. Did you notice how Jesus equates this spiritual formation, this spiritual transformation to birth, to something new, to new life? He says, if you really want to be a follower of me, he tells Nicodemus, you must be born from above. Why? Because when new things are born, it brings joy. And sometimes we forget about that joy. Sometimes when we're talking about the life of following Christ and how it is to be born again or born from above, as Jesus would say, somewhere along the way, some of us, and don't get spiritual on me this morning, we lose that sense of joy. I think David said it like this. We read it earlier. He said he was in a particular place in his life and he was struggling with his relationship with God, and he came to a place where he says, you know what I want you to do, God? I want you to restore to me the joy of salvation. Some of us have lost our joy. And it's no wonder why the world has a hard time following Christians, because we come here every week with our legs crossed, arms folded, lips twisted up like we just ate a box of lemons, talking about I'm following Jesus, and we have no joy. David says, look, I know my life is rough. I know that I've been going through some things in my life. God, I need you to restore to me the joy of salvation. How many of you know that being a follower of Jesus should produce some joy? there should be some happiness and some joy and some excitement and a sense of adventure, but somehow along the way we've allowed the cares of life and the struggles in family and the struggles with our finances to completely suck us of the joy that comes from following Jesus. Restore to us, God, the joy of salvation. It's kind of hard for people to want to follow the God that we say we follow when we're always mad about something. You ever known anybody like that? Just like a pit bull, just mad all the time. And there's something about Jesus equating this birth, this new thing that God wants to do, to the fact that there should be joy. As a matter of fact, Jesus says something extremely interesting in John chapter 15. I want to start with verse 11, then we're going to back up into the text because I want us to find a way to believe again in the joy that comes from following Jesus. You don't have to be angry all the time. I know things are bad, but you don't have to be frustrated all the time. Jesus says this in John chapter 15. Let me start with 11, then we'll back up to the beginning. He says, I have told you these things so that you will be filled with my joy. Yes, your joy will overflow. Did you catch what he said? He says, I'm about to tell you something, or I just told you something so that you can be filled with my joy. Anybody in here need some joy this morning? That the cares of life and the concerns of life, and maybe you lost someone over this past year, maybe someone you know is sick, maybe you're struggling in your finances, maybe things are not the way you want them on the job, and if you're not careful, you wake up one morning and you have no joy. Jesus says, I'm going to tell you something, and when I tell you this, it's going to give you not just any joy, it's going to give you my joy. And what I'm going to tell you and what I just told you is going to give you my joy, and then he says, and then your joy will be overflowing. I don't know about you, but I need some joy this morning. That's good preaching right there. I need some joy. Because life gets hard and situations get tough and things go wrong and people let you down and you get confused and frustrated and afraid. God, I need you to restore to me the joy of knowing you. It doesn't matter what I'm going through. It doesn't matter what I'm facing. It doesn't matter how things have gone. It doesn't matter who's sick, who's not sick, who has my back, who doesn't have my back. If I have Jesus, I should have joy. Jesus says, look, I'm telling you something, and the reason I'm telling you this is because I want you to be filled with my joy. Yes. And your joy will overflow. Now, there's a lot more in that text to talk about, but I just want to work through verses 1 through 11, if you don't mind, this morning, because we want to kind of focus on the idea. If I had a chance to kind of tag this subject, I want to believe this morning that we're better. So I want to talk about from the subject, believe that you're better. You are. Believe that you are better. Did you notice that Jesus said that what I just told you, the result should be an overwhelming and overflowing joy? Now, here's why I started there. Because Jesus is about to say something that, if I were to be honest, and if I were to tell you how it dealt with me, it really messed with me. And I would be lying to you this morning if I would tell you that I don't want what Jesus is about to say to mess with you the way that it messed with me. I want it to mess with you. I want what Jesus is about to say to actually cause some turmoil and some conflict, because Jesus says, I'm telling you this so that you might have my joy. The same way that I wrestle with it, the same way that I struggle with it, the same way that I said, you know what, Jesus, I'm not feeling you on this whole process, but he says, but it's so that you can have joy. Not just any kind of joy, but it's so that you can have my joy. Anybody want some Jesus joy this morning? You know, when I was growing up, the church that I grew up in used to sing this song, said that this joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me and the world can't take it away. I need that kind of joy. Jesus says, look, I'm telling you something, and it's because I want you to have my joy. Now here it goes. It's going to mess with you, but But remember, the end result is that we get his joy. Verse number 1, he says, I am the true grapevine, and my Father is a gardener. And he cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit, so they will produce even more. I'm going to read through all of it, then we'll go back to the top. He says, you have already been pruned and purified by the message I have given you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you, for a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. Yes, I am the vine, and you are the branches. You notice he said that twice. He wants to get it straight. I am the vine. You are the branches. And those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. And anyone who does not remain in me is thrown away like a useless branch and withers. And such branches are gathered into a pile to be burned. But if you remain in me and my words remain in you, you may ask for anything you want, and it will be granted. When you produce much fruit, here we go, you are my true disciples. Let me read that again. When you produce much fruit, you are my true disciples, and this brings great glory to the Father. And I have loved you even as the Father has loved me. Remain in my love. When you obey my commandments and you remain in my love, just as I obey my Father's commandments and remain in his love. Then he says, I have told you these things so that you will be filled with my joy. Yes, your joy will overflow. Now check this out. Did you notice that Jesus does something that is particularly interesting as far as breaking down and busting our little spiritual bubble of thinking that we understand the totality of what salvation is about? Because remember, Jesus is talking now not to just, anybody. He's talking to his followers. This is almost like a family meeting. Can we have a family meeting this morning? Is that all right? He's talking to people that are his followers, people that are devoted to him, people that said, you know what, we have intentionally decided to follow you. So Jesus says, check this out, you are my branches. Did you notice that he claims us? He says it a little bit later on in the text. We haven't read it, but he says, you know what, I chose you. You didn't choose me. Aren't you glad that Jesus chose you? When you weren't able to kind of figure it out for yourself, when you weren't able to decipher who it is that I should be following and what I should do, Jesus says, you are my branches. I chose you. Let's get it straight. He said, I chose you despite the fact that you had addictions. I chose you despite the fact that you struggle with unforgiveness. I chose you despite the fact that you have a hidden sin that nobody knows about. I chose you. Now, I got just enough Pentecostal in me this morning to start some trouble. So that's a good place to get your shout on. Jesus chose you. Look, I didn't come up with this thing on my own. I didn't decide that God is God. I didn't decide that Jesus is who he says he is. Jesus says, you know what, I chose you. Yeah, the you that doesn't always believe in me, the you that sometimes struggles, the you that sometimes doubts, the you that sometimes doesn't want to do what you're supposed to do, the you that sometimes is disobedient. I chose you. So he says, look, you are my branches. You're my branches. You belong to me. But here's the trip. Here's the part that really messed with me, and I'm praying that it'll mess with you too. He says that even though you're mine, check out what he says. He says that God will cut off the branches that don't produce any fruit. Uh-oh, you said it. Now here's why that's important, because when I grew up in a church that really didn't teach us soteriology. That is your theology of salvation. What is it that you believe about salvation? And I grew up in a church where it was just a get out of hell free card. And I tell people, my dad was a pastor, and I didn't get baptized until I was about 17, which is extremely old when your dad's a pastor. Like, you should have did that when you were 3. And I tell people all the time, I had this discussion with our students on Wednesday, that when I got baptized, I went down a dry devil and came up a wet one. Because nobody really taught me what it really meant to be saved. And here's why, if you don't have a proper soteriology, here's why it will mess with you. Because I knew that from what I was taught that being saved meant that I couldn't go to hell. So guess what happened when I got baptized? I started doing all the really good sins. Because I can't go to hell now. You laughing, you did the same thing. Don't laugh, you feel me. But Jesus says there's something bigger at stake here. Because even though you're my branches, check this out, he says those branches that don't bear fruit, the Father will cut you off. So here's what he's saying, it is possible to be here and not be healthy. It is possible rather, to be mine and not have a life that's meaningful. That it's possible to actually be a branch. And he says, but here's why you got to understand that, because it's much bigger than just saying, I belong to Jesus. Did you catch that? He says, you're my branches. I claim you, but there's some of us here, family meeting. There's some of us, and there's some institutions, and there's some organizations, and there's some individuals that belong to me. But check this out. He says, just because you're here or just because you're his doesn't mean your relationship is healthy. And that really messed with me, because Jesus never claimed that these branches were not his, but he said there are some people who are claiming to be connected to me who don't bear fruit. That's tough teaching right there, isn't it? I'm praying it messes with you like it messes with me. Because Jesus says, you're mine, I chose you, I claim you, I love you, but let's get it straight. There's something extremely unhealthy about this connection. And really what Jesus is saying is, he's saying what non-followers of Christ and what non-Jesus people have been saying for centuries, and it's amazing how the world can understand this, but we don't quite get it. If you say you follow Jesus, where is the fruit? See, there's some evangelistic elements in that text, because he's saying, you know what? The problem is that everybody else sees it and you don't even see it. That's why it's hard for people to believe in the Jesus that we serve, because even the world knows that if you say you follow Jesus, there ought to be some signs. If you say that you belong to Jesus, if you're one of the branches, he's saying there has to be some kind of proof that your relationship is healthy. If you say you follow Jesus, see, sometimes as branches, we don't always understand it, but even the world gets it, and sometimes that's the thing that blocks people from wanting to follow the Jesus that we serve, because even I know that if you're a Jesus follower, I don't follow Jesus, I don't believe in all that stuff, but I know, according to the Bible, that if you say you follow Jesus, something about you has to be different than how it is with us. Jesus says, look, you're mine, I claim you, but there's something extremely unhealthy about this relationship. There's something extremely unhealthy about the fact that you've been saved for 20 years. Huh? You've been saved for 5 years. And there's no fruit. You've been an organization, you've been a church, you've been a ministry, you've been a campus outreach for 10 years, and yet there's no fruit. Remember, Jesus says, I'm saying this so that you can have joy. Don't forget that. Right? Because we get to squirm and when we talk all of this deep stuff. But Jesus says, look, I said this so that you can enjoy my joy. But listen, there are some branches that are unhealthy. And part of what we need to recognize is that just because I'm his does not mean that I'm healthy. And just because Jesus says you are mine, it does not mean that my life has meaning. Because there's something much bigger than just being saved. Jesus says, and remember he said it, I'm going to read it to you again. He says it in verse number 8, when you produce much fruit, you are my true disciples. So now I can't float around in my spiritual arrogance telling people that I'm following Jesus if there's no fruit. And maybe some of the reason why I've lost the joy of my salvation is because my relationship is unhealthy. Remember, Jesus says, I'm telling you this, I know it's hard, I know it's tough. You know, the old preacher used to say it's tight, but it's right. He said, I know it's hard, but here's why I'm saying this, so that you can experience joy. He says there's something unhealthy about someone who claims to be connected. Remember, this is a family meeting this morning, right? There's something extremely unhealthy about someone who is connected to me, and yet you've been saved 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 20 years. There's no fruit. Jesus says, look, I want you. I claim you. I love you. And I'm telling you this because I love you. At some point, you got to realize there's got to be some fruit. And remember, I'm telling you all this because I want you to have some joy. That maybe some of your frustration, maybe some of your anger, maybe some of your unhappiness is tied to the fact that somehow along the way our relationship became unhealthy and you stopped producing fruit. And now you have no joy. But did you notice that Jesus said there are some branches that have to be cut off, but then there's some other branches that are bearing fruit, and I got to cut them too. Uh-oh. Somebody just say, don't make them cut you. That either way you put it, there's some cutting involved. Jesus says there's some branches that don't produce fruit. I got to cut them, but even if you produce a little bit of fruit, here it comes. In order for you to have some joy, I got to cut you. Whoo, that's hard, ain't it? That messed me up. Because who wants to be in a relationship with Jesus and Jesus is the cause of your chaos? Woo, y'all didn't receive that. What do you do when Jesus is the cause, when God is the cause for what Jesus calls a pruning? See, it's one thing for me to blame it on the devil. We love that, right? Y'all know Flip Wilson, the old school. The devil made me do it. But what happens when the reason why you're experiencing cutting and loss and pruning is because God knows I can get more out of you? Now that kind of messed me up. That hurt. Wait a minute, Jesus. You talked about the branches that ain't bearing any fruit, so you mean to tell me you're going to cut me too? Jesus said it's the ones who already, let me read it to you again. He says, he cuts off, he meaning the Father is the gardener, he cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit so they will produce even more. Did you notice that there is some kind of way where we have to show the initiative to bear some fruit in order for Jesus to come in and say, okay, now I see you trying a little bit, let me come in and prune you so you can do better. In other words, he says there's two types of branches. There's the branches who show no initiative whatsoever, and there's the branches, even though you can't produce your own righteousness, he says, I see you working on it. I see you trying. I see you praying. I see you're making and taking the initiative to try to bear some fruit. So guess what I got to do in order to give you some joy? Now that I see that you're trying, I got to come in and cut you. That's not what we want to hear, is it? Wait a minute, Jesus, I'm trying now. Don't mess with me. Have you ever felt like God is picking on you? You say, God, I'm doing the right thing. I'm trying my hardest. I'm praying. I'm tithing. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm trying to be obedient. Why is it that you keep picking on me? And God says, because you can be better. Woo. See, it's one thing when I'm not doing the right thing, and you know when you're not doing the right thing. It's one thing when I'm struggling and I have issues and I have unrepentant sin, but God, I'm trying my best. I'm doing the right thing. Why do you keep messing with me? God says, because I believe that you can be better. And in order for you to have some joy, that means because I see you taking the initiative to bear some fruit, I want you to have more joy in your life. So guess what? I got to cut you. That's hard, isn't it? Because why does it feel like I'm being punished for doing the right thing? Anybody ever been there before? You try to do the right thing on your job, and it seems like things just keep getting messed up, and you're always in the center of a whole mess. And you know, God, I'm praying, I'm trying to do the right thing. I come to work on time. I don't take extra for lunch. These jokers over here doing whatever they want to do. I'm trying to honor you, and you keep messing with me. Jesus says, if you're bearing a little bit of fruit, then I got to prune you so that you can do better. And here's the thing that I think that we need to understand, is that God is committed to getting the most out of you. That God is committed to getting the most out of you as an individual, to getting the most out of you as a family, to getting the most out of you and us as a collection of families who meet in this place called New Community Church. God believes that we can be better. Just got to cut us. Just got to work on it. He said, I see you trying hard, baby. I see you praying. I see you trying to do your thing. And because I know that there's so much more on the inside of you. And remember, I'm telling you all this so that you can have joy. I understand that things are tough, and I understand that you feel like I'm messing with you, I'm picking on you, you're trying to do the right thing. It seems like you're getting punished for doing the right thing, but God says, I believe that you can be better. Part of the process means there's got to be some pruning. And notice what Jesus says over 5, 6, maybe even 7 times he uses the word produce. Did you notice that? And he also said that the end result is that you bear some fruit because there's a connection between you being a true disciple. Notice he said true. There's a connection between you being a true disciple and the production of fruit. In other words, don't tell the world that you're following Jesus unless some fruit. Jesus says, my Father's got to do something extraordinary in being able to make sure that you have some fruit. And here's what I want you to understand this morning, because some of us have lost our joy. Some of us have lost the excitement and the sense of adventure of following Jesus. And Jesus says, I'm telling you all this so I can give you joy. Here it goes, that pruning is proof of your potential. That didn't land the way I wanted it to, so let me try it again. Pruning is proof that you got potential. And I like to tell people, as long as you got a pulse, God can do something with you. As long as you're still kicking and breathing, as long as we as a body is still kicking and breathing, God is going to prune, because he says, I can believe that you can be better than what you are right now. And as long as you got a pulse, I'm going to keep pruning, because pruning is proof that you have potential. Don't give up, because I'm going to get some fruit out of you. Don't throw in the towel, because I believe you can be better. I tell people this all the time. One of the ways that I got here, most people know, I was a hospice chaplain for almost 4 years, and at the same time I was pastoring a little church for almost 4 years. And I remember in the midst of my struggle trying to figure out what it is that God was trying to lead me to next, after almost 4 years of doing 2 things at one time, I prayed this prayer, and I tell people this all the time. I pray this prayer and I continue to pray it. I pray, God, put me where you can get the most out of me. But that's one of those prayers, like when you pray for patience, you know what happens, right? But people say, man, I'm praying for patience. No, don't do that. Because as soon as you say, God, give me more patience, he's going to send some people around you who are going to annoy you, who are going to irritate you. Well, God, I'm praying to learn how to forgive. Don't do that, because he's going to send some people around you that's going to harm you. And so when I prayed that prayer, I said, you know what, God, I want you to put me in a place where you can get the most out of me. And God said, let me get out my shears. Because now I got to cut you. And pruning is proof that God sees that you have potential. Now let me give you 3 things. 3 things that I think is going to help us as we're in the pursuit of getting this joy back. Remember, Jesus said, I'm telling you this so you can have joy. I know it's hard. I know it's going to feel bad. I know it doesn't look good, smell good, sound good, feel good. But all of this is so that you can have joy. Now, I looked up this whole idea of pruning because I'm not an agricultural or horticultural person. I'm a city boy. But I looked up, and there's a lot of things that are described in this idea of bearing fruit. But here's 3 things that I want you to consider. The first thing is that when you're pruning a grapevine, you got to be prepared to cut off 80 to 90% of past growth. You know why that's important? Because I think that somehow over the course of our lives, and especially in the West, we have connected our spiritual walk and our Christianity to success over significance. Jesus says that people who have a hard time of letting go have what I call an unhealthy attachment to past success. See, the things that didn't go well, we really want to let that go, don't we? But it's the stuff that went well 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We want to keep doing it over and over again. And Jesus says, when you're getting pruned, 80 to 90% of the stuff that went right, you got to let it go. Don't reduce me to the last way that I blessed you. And part of our struggle is that we are more confined to the idea that it's about success rather than significance. See, Jesus says when you get pruned, you got to cut off 80 to 90% of that stuff, because it's not about how much you had. It's about getting down to the most significant parts. And sometimes in being pruned, we got to be saying, you know what, God, I know that was great, but help me to search for significance. Help my life to mean something. The old church I grew up in, the old women used to say, may the works that I've done speak for me. So it don't matter how many butts I had in the seat. It doesn't matter how many dollars I had in the bank. It doesn't matter how many zeros. It doesn't matter how many degrees. God, help me to whittle down all those things so that you can make something significant out of my life. 80 to 90%, you got to be willing to let it go. Here's the other thing is that you got to understand when you're pruning a grapevine that too many shoots, if you ever seen a grapevine, too many shoots suck up all the nutrients. Some of y'all got some suckers in your life. Matter of fact, just say goodbye, sucker, goodbye, sucker. Because sometimes we have too much stuff going on and it takes away from what God is trying to do. Some of you got too many voices in your ear. Some of us have too many people that don't have godly opinions talking to us and telling us what to do and how to live our life. And Jesus says if you got too much stuff going on, that sucks the joy out of your life to the point you don't produce any fruit. Some of us got some things that are sucking our joy. I'm telling you. And God says, when I start pruning, don't be surprised when some of that stuff and some of those people and some of those situations got to go. Here's the last thing, then I'm done. Is that when you go through a pruning process, remember Jesus saying that I want you to listen to this because it's going to produce joy. He says you got to find the strongest shoot. You got to find the strongest branch, the one that comes up out of the ground. And after you cut off all the stuff from the past and after you deal with all the stuff that's sucking your joy, he says you got to find something to attach it. You need a training stake that you put in the ground and you allow that thing to raise up and be trained. Here's where I'm going. Now, some of us need to focus on where God has called us and what is our strongest attribute, and then find somebody that's going to help us develop that. Because a lot of times in the church, we're good at this. We get so spiritual that we forget the fact that Jesus himself had people that he mentored. Remember, Paul told Timothy, the things that I'm teaching you, teach it to other men who can teach it to other men. That he said, you know what, if you want to be raised up, if you want to have some significance, you want to bear some fruit, you need to attach yourself to somebody who's going to help you to grow up. And there's a large part of the fact that sometimes we lose our joy because we don't have anybody to lean on. Somebody who's going to correct us, somebody who's going to encourage us, somebody who's going to help us to understand what living in joy means. He says, find you somebody that you can lean on. Find you a church where you can find a group and you can find a small group. That's why we talk about community groups so much, because you need some people who are going to help you bear some fruit. See, proof of your potential is found in the fact that Jesus says God is going to prune you. So no matter how bad it feels like God is picking on you, he's taking stuff away from you. Remember David in the beginning, Pastor William read it, he said, you know what? God, renew in me a right spirit. And then he later goes on to say, to help restore the joy of my salvation. See, pruning is proof of your potential. Jesus has something wonderful planned for you, for us together, but that means that we got to be willing to endure the fact that God's got to cut us. But he's doing it because he believes that we can be better. Let's pray. God, we thank you. We thank you for the fact that, for the simple fact that you allow us to experience things because you see in us that we can be better. God, I thank you that you don't just leave us alone and you don't just totally cut us off, but sometimes the trials and the tribulation and all the things that we go through are just a sign and just a result of the fact that you have looked into our souls, you looked into our lives, you know the beginning from the end, and you see that we can be better than what we are right now. So God, help us as a people, help us individually, help us as families, help us as a church family to understand the process through which you're taking us, because you can see that we can be better. God, help us to understand and help us to embrace the fact that sometimes the fact that you're making us better can actually be the cause of our pain and our frustration, but in the end, you promise that it will be a trade from our joy to yours so that our joy will overflow. God, I pray that you will help us in this body to be reminded and restored to the joy of following you. That when all the business is said and done, when all of the politics is said and done, when all of the fighting is said and done, help us to return to a place where we can be joyful just because you love us. That's all that we need. God, we thank you. We love you so, so much. Restore to us the joy of salvation and help us to be better. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.